Hey there, tankers! This is Dauntless Sam, and today we'll be looking at the T-26 and its driving characteristics in War Thunder. The T-26 tank was a Soviet light infantry tank used during many conflicts in the 1930s and in World War II. It was developed of the British Vickers 6-ton tank and was one of the most successful tank designs of the 1930s until its light armor became vulnerable to newer anti-tank guns. It was produced in greater numbers than any other tank of the period, with more than 11,000 manufactured. During the 1930s, the USSR developed 53 variants of the T-26, including flamethrowing tanks, combat engineer tanks, remotely controlled tanks, self-propelled guns, artillery tractors, and armored carriers. 23 of these were series produced. Others were experimental models. The T-26, together with the BT, was the main tank of the Red Army's armored forces during the interwar period. The T-26 was the most important tank of the Spanish Civil War and played a significant role during the Battle of Lake Kazan in 1938, as well as the Winter War in 1939 through 1940. Though nearly obsolete by the beginning of World War II, the T-26 was the most numerous tank in the Red Army's armored force during the German invasion of the Soviet Union in June of 1941. The T-26 fought the Germans and their allies during the Battle of Moscow in 1941 through 42, the Battle of Stalingrad, and the Battle of the Caucasus in 1942 through 43. Some tank units of the Leningrad Front used their T-26s until 1944. Soviet T-26 light tanks last saw use in August of 1945 during the defeat of the Japanese Kwantung Army in Manchuria. The T-26 was exported and used extensively by Spain, China, and Turkey. Captured T-26s were used by the Finnish, German, Romanian, and Hungarian armies. The tank was reliable and simple to maintain, and its design was continually modernized between 1931 and 1941. No new models of the T-26 were developed after 1940. The T-26 was a Soviet development of the British Vickers 6-ton tank, which was designed by Vickers Armstrongs Company in 1928 through 1929. The simple and easy-to-maintain Vickers 6-ton was intended for export to less technically advanced countries: the Soviet Union, Poland, Brazil, Argentina, Japan, Thailand, China, and many others. Vickers advertised the tank in military publications, and both the Soviet Union and Poland expressed interest in the Vickers design. In early 1930, the Soviet Buying Committee arrived in Great Britain to select tanks, tractors, and cars for use in the Red Army. The Vickers 6-ton was among 4 models of tanks selected by Soviet representatives during their visit to Vickers Armstrongs. Under the contract signed on May 28, 1930, the company delivered to the USSR 15 twin-turreted Vickers Mark E tanks, together with full technical documentation to enable series production of the tank in the USSR. The ability of the 2 turrets of the Type A to turn independently made it possible to both fire to the left and to the right at once, which was considered advantageous for breakthroughs of field entrenchments. Several Soviet engineers participated in assembly of the tanks in the Vickers factory in 1930. The first 4 Vickers 6-ton tanks arrived in the USSR at the end of 1930. The last tanks arrived in 1932, when series production of the T-26 was already in progress. The British tanks were sent to Soviet factories for study in preparation for series production and to military educational institutions and training units. Later, some tanks were given to military supply depots and proving grounds. The Vickers-built 6-ton tanks had the designator V-26 in the USSR. 3 British tanks were successfully tested for cross-country ability at the small proving ground near Moscow in January of 1931. Kliment Voroshilov ordered the creation of the Special Commission for the Red Army New Tanks, under the direction of S. Ginsburg, to define the tank type suitable for the Red Army. The T-19 8-ton light infantry tank, developed by S. Ginsburg under the program at the Blosivik plant in Leningrad, was a competitor to the British Vickers 6-ton. The first prototype of the complex and expensive T-19 was finished in August of 1931. Because both tanks had advantages and disadvantages, S. Ginsburg suggested developing a more powerful hybrid tank, so-called the improved T-19, with the whole home-developed engine and armament from the native T-19, and the transmission and chassis from the British Vickers 6-ton. On January 26, 1931, the head of the Department of Mechanization and Motorization of the Red Army wrote a letter to S. Ginsburg with information obtained via intelligence service that the Polish government had decided to purchase Vickers 6-ton light infantry tanks as well as Christie M1931 cavalry tanks, and to mass-produce them with the assistance of both the British and French. Because Poland was then considered, in Soviet military doctrine, to be the USSR's main enemy, the Soviet Revolutionary Military Council decided to pass the foreign tanks into Red Army service, starting their production immediately without waiting for the completion of development works, in order to counter possible aggression. At that time, the Red Army had only several dozen outdated Mark V and Mark A and Renault FT-17 tanks captured during the Russian Civil War, together with various armored cars and the obsolete domestic MS-1 T-18 light infantry tanks. On February 13, 1931, the Vickers 6-ton light infantry tank under the designator T-26 officially entered service in the Red Army as the main tank for close support and combined arms units and tank units of High Command Reserve. One of the Vickers 6-ton tanks, equipped with Soviet-made turrets for the pilot batch of T-26 tanks, was tested for gunfire resistance in August of 1931. The hull was subjected to rifle and Maxim machine gun fire with the use of normal and armor-piercing bullets at a range of 50 meters. It was found that the armor withstood gunfire with minimal damage, only some rivets were damaged. Chemical analysis showed that the front armor plates were made from high-quality cemented armor, whereas the homogeneous roof and bottom armor plates were made from mediocre steel. Even so, the British armor was better than the armor produced in Soviet factories for the first T-26s because of a shortage of modern metallurgical equipment in the USSR at the time. At the same time, the Faculty of Mechanization and Motorization of the Military Technical Academy developed two tank models based on the Vickers 6-ton tank design, but with an American Hercules 95 horsepower, 6-cylinder water-cooled engine, improved front armor, and a driver's position on the left side. The TMM-1 was equipped with transmission details from the native Ya-5 truck, and a ball mount for the DT tank machine gun in the front of the hull, whereas the TMM-2 was equipped with an improved gearbox, a steering device without clutches, and 37mm Hotchkiss gun in the right turret. Representatives from the main Soviet tank manufacturers, together with officials from the Red Army Mobilization Department, considered the Hercules engine to be too difficult to produce, and the engine tended to overheat inside the engine compartment. Tests of the TMM-1 and 2 prototypes performed in the beginning of 1932 demonstrated no advantage over the Vickers 6-ton and the T-26. The Soviets did not simply replicate the Vickers 6-ton. Like its British counterpart, the T-26 Mod 1931 had a twin-turreted configuration and was designed to carry two machine guns, mounting one in each turret. A major difference between the Soviet T-26 Mod 1931 and the British 6-ton were higher turrets on the T-26, with an observation slit. Soviet turrets had a round firing port for the DT tank machine gun, as opposed to the rectangular ports used by the original British design for the Vickers machine gun. The front part of the hull was also slightly modified. Hulls of the twin-turreted T-26s were assembled using armored plates riveted to a frame from metal angles. Some tanks, produced in 1931, had sealing zinc shims at the hull bottom between armored plates for fording water obstacles. After problems with rain entering the engine compartment, a special cover was installed over an air outlet window after March 1932. Some T-26s produced at the end of 1932 and 1933 had a riveted and welded hull. The T-26 Mod 1931 had two cylindrical turrets mounted on ball bearings. Each turret turned independently through 240 degrees. Both turrets could provide common fire in front and rear arcs. The disadvantage of such a configuration was that all the tank's firepower could not be used at once on the same side. 4 modifications of turrets existed, and they were mounted on tanks in different combinations. The hull and turrets of the T-26 Mod 1931 had a maximum armor thickness of 13 to 15 millimeters, which was sufficient to withstand light machine gun fire. Many twin-turreted tanks of the first series had 10mm armor plates of low quality, which could be penetrated by 7.62mm armor-piercing bullets from 150 meters. In 1933, the Soviets unveiled the T-26 Mod 1933. The Model 1933, with a new single-cylindrical turret, carried one 45mm cannon and one 7.62mm machine gun, became the most common T-26 variant. The 45mm 20K tank gun was based on the Soviet 45mm anti-tank gun 19K. The T-26 could carry up to 3 secondary DT 7.62mm machine guns in coaxial, rear, and anti-aircraft mounts. This increased firepower was intended to aid crews in defeating dedicated anti-tank teams, as the original machine gun armament was found to be insufficient. The turret rear ball mounting for the additional DT tank machine gun was installed on the T-26 tanks from the end of 1935 until 1939. The T-26 Model 1933 carried 122 rounds of 45mm ammunition, firing armor-piercing 45mm rounds with a muzzle velocity of 820 meters per second, or lower-velocity high-explosive munitions. Tanks intended for company commanders were equipped with a radio set and a handrail radio antenna on the turret. Later, the handrail antenna was replaced with a buggy whip antenna, because experience in the Spanish Civil War and Battle of Lake Kazan showed that the handrail antenna drew fire onto commander tanks. The tank was powered by a T-26 90-horsepower flat-row 4-cylinder air-cooled petrol engine, which was a complete Soviet copy of the Armstrong-Siddeley engine used in the Vickers 6-ton. The engine was located in the rear part of the hull. Early Soviet-made tank engines were of bad quality, but they became better beginning in 1934. The T-26 engine did not have an overspeed limiter, which often resulted in overheating and engine valve breakage, especially in the summer. A fuel tank for 182 liters and an oil box for 27 liters were placed alongside the engine. The engine required top-grade petrol. The use of second-rate petrol could cause damage to the valve units because of engine detonation. From mid-1932, a larger fuel tank of 290 liters and a simplified oil box were introduced. An engine cooling fan was mounted over the engine in a special shroud. From early 1932, the exhaust silencer was affixed by 3 clamps instead of 2. The transmission of the T-26 consisted of a single-disc main dry clutch, a gearbox with 5 gears in the front part of the vehicle, steering clutches, final drives, and band brakes. The gearbox was connected to the engine by a drive shaft passing through the vehicle. A gear change lever was mounted directly on the gearbox. A tank suspension for each side consisted of 2 bogies, 4 rubber-covered return rollers, a tank driving wheel, and a track idler. Each bogie consisted of a cast box, 4 twin rubber-covered road wheels connected by balancing levers, and 2 1/4 eclipse leaf springs. The cast track driving wheel with removable sprocket ring was located in the front, and the track idler with a crank lever tightener was located in the rear part of the vehicle. A tank made from chrome nickel steel was 260 millimeters wide and consisted of 108 to 109 links. The T-26 Mod 1931 did not have a radio set. The tank commander communicated with the driver by speaking tube, which was replaced with a signaling lamp in 1932. The T-26 was equipped with 1 fire extinguisher, a kit of spare parts, tools, and accessories, a canvas stowage, and a tow chain fixed on the rear of the hull. The T-26 could cross 3/4 of a meter high obstacles and 2.1 meter wide trenches, ford 0.8 meter deep water obstacles, cut 33 centimeter trees, and climb 40-degree gradients. It was easy to drive. Beginning in 1937, there was an effort to equip many tanks with a second machine gun in the rear of the turret and an anti-aircraft machine gun on top of it, as well as the addition of 2 searchlights above the gun for night gunnery, a new VKU-3 command system, and a TPU-3 intercom. Some tanks had a vertically stabilized top-1 gun telescopic sight. Ammunition stowage for the main gun was improved from 122 rounds to 147. In 1938, the cylindrical turret was replaced by a conical turret with the same 45mm Model 1934 gun. Some T-26s Mod 1938-1939, equipped with radio set, had a PTK commander's panoramic sight. In 1938, the T-26 was upgraded to the Model 1938 version, which had a new conical turret with better anti-bullet resistance, but the same welded hull as the T-26 Mod 1933 produced in 1935 and 1936. This proved insufficient in the Battle of Lake Kazan in 1938, so the tank was upgraded once more in February of 1939 to have an under-turret box with sloped 20mm side armored plates. The turret featured an increase to 20mm at 18-degree sloping. This time, it was designated T-26-1. There were subsequent attempts to thicken the front plate, but T-26 production soon ended in favor of other designs, such as the T-34. The T-26 entered active service for the Red Army in 1932. It was used in many conflicts of the 1930s as well as during World War II. The T-26, together with the BT, was the main tank of the Red Army Armored Forces during the interwar period. The T-26 light tank first saw action in the Spanish Civil War. The Soviet Union provided Republican Spain with a total of 281 T-26 Mod 1933 tanks starting in October of 1936. The T-26s were used in almost all military operations of the Spanish Civil War in 1936 through 1939 against nationalists and demonstrated superiority over German Panzer I light tanks and Italian CV-33 tankettes armed with only machine guns. During the Battle of Guadalajara, T-26s outclassed the Italian tankettes, inspiring the design of the first Italian medium tank, the Fiat M1340. The next military operation the T-26 light tank participated in was the Soviet-Japanese border conflict, commencing with the Battle of Lake Kazan in July of 1938. The 2nd Mechanized Brigade, the 32nd, and the 40th Independent Tank Battalions had 257 T-26s, from which 76 tanks were damaged and 9 burnt towards the end of battle action. A small number of T-26 tanks and flamethrowing tanks based on the T-26 chassis participated in the Battle of Cock and Gull against Japanese forces in 1939. The T-26 was vulnerable to Japanese tank-killing teams armed with Molotov cocktails. Poor quality welds left gaps in the armor plate, and flaming petrol easily seeped into the fighting compartment and engine compartment. The 37mm gun on the Japanese Type 95 light tank, despite its mediocre performance, was also effective against the T-26. Portions of the armor plating on earlier models of the T-26 used riveted construction and were very vulnerable to both types of attacks. The use of riveted armor on some older T-26 models led to spalling, when the impact of enemy shells, even if they failed to disable the tank or kill the crew on their own, caused the rivets to break off and become projectiles inside the tank. On the eve of World War II, T-26s served mainly in separate light tank brigades and in separate tank battalions of rifle divisions. This was the type of tank units that participated in the Soviet invasion of Poland in September of 1939 and in the Winter War of December 1939 through March 1940. The Winter War proved that the T-26 was obsolete and its design reserve was totally depleted. Finnish 37mm anti-tank guns and even 20mm anti-tank rifles easily penetrated the T-26's thin anti-bullet armor, and the tank units equipped with the T-26 suffered significant losses during the breakthrough of the Mannerheim Line, in which the flame-throwing tanks based on the T-26 chassis played a significant role. By mid-1941, most of the Red Army's vast number of tanks were suffering from serious wear and tear. Poor quality roads, the vulnerabilities of track design in the 1930s, and inadequate maintenance, recovery, and repair services all took their toll. In some of the front-line armored units, up to half of the T-26, T-28, and BT tanks had major drivetrain components, which were broken down or completely worn out. And these disabled tanks were parked and cannibalized for spare parts to keep the rest running. Tanks damaged during the 1939 Winter War with Finland were also cannibalized for parts. On June 1, 1941, the Red Army had 10,268 T-26 light tanks of all models in their inventories, including armored combat vehicles based on the T-26 chassis. The T-26 composed a majority of the fighting vehicles of the Soviet Mechanized Corps of the border military districts. For instance, the Western Special Military District had 1,136 T-26 tanks on June 22nd of 1941, 52% of all tanks in the district. The T-26 Mod 1938-39 especially could withstand most German tanks in 1941, but were inferior to the Panzer III and Panzer IV participating in Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, and all of the Red Army's tank models suffered severe losses due to complete air supremacy of the German Luftwaffe and firepower of Germany's Panzer III and Panzer IV medium tanks. The majority of the Red Army's T-26s were lost in the first months of the German-Soviet War, mainly to enemy artillery and airstrikes and tank gunfire. Many tanks broke down for technical reasons and lack of spare parts. As the war progressed, and Germany's lighter tanks were replaced by the Panzer III, Panzer IV, and heavier tanks such as the Panther, the T-26 was gradually replaced through attrition by the vastly superior T-34. The remaining T-26s participated in battles with the Germans and their allies during the Battle of Moscow in 1941 and 42, the Battle of Stalingrad, and the Battle of Caucasus in 1942 and 43. Some tank units of the Leningrad Front used their T-26 tanks until 1944. The defeat of the Japanese in Manchuria in August of 1945 was the last military operation in which Soviet T-26s were used. In the 1930s, T-26 light tanks were delivered to Spain, China, and Turkey. They were used in the Second Sino-Japanese War by the Chinese in 1938 through 1944, especially in the Battle of Kunlun Pass. The Finnish army used captured T-26s of different models during the Continuation War, and some tanks served in Finland for various non-combat purposes until 1961. Captured T-26s were also used by German, Romanian, and Hungarian armies. In War Thunder ground forces, there are two variants of the T-26, the T-26 Mod 1939 light tank and the premium T-26E light tank. The T-26 Mod 1939 is a Rank 1 Battle Rating 1.0 reserve light tank. It has 91 horsepower at 2200 RPM and a maximum speed of 30 km per hour. The turret has a maximum inclination of 57 degrees, a rotation speed of 6 degrees per second, and a gun depression of -6 degrees. Its hull armor is 15 mm in the front, 15 mm in the side, and 6 mm in the rear. Its turret armor is 15 mm in the front, sides, and rear. Its gun has a reloading rate of 3.8 seconds. The T-26E is a Rank 1, battle rating 1.7 premium light tank. It has 91 horsepower at 2200 RPM and a maximum speed of 30 km per hour. The turret has a maximum inclination of 43 degrees, a rotation speed of 6 degrees per second, and a gun depression of -6 degrees. Its hull armor is 30 mm at the front, 30 mm in the side, and 6 mm in the rear. Its turret armor is 15 mm at the front, 15 mm in the sides, and 30 mm in the rear. It has a reloading rate of 3.8 seconds. Both tanks can be loaded with BR-243 armor-piercing high-explosive shells, BR-243 SP armor-piercing shells, and O-243 high-explosive shells. The BR-243 shell has a projectile mass of 1.4 kilograms and a muzzle velocity of 760 meters per second. Its armor penetration is 53 mm at 10 meters, 52 mm at 100 meters, 43 mm at 500 meters, 35 mm at 1,000 meters, 28 mm at 1,500 meters, and 23 mm at 2,000 meters. The BR-243 SP shell has a projectile mass of 1.4 kilograms and a muzzle velocity of 757 meters per second. Its armor penetration is 61 mm at 10 meters, 57 mm at 100 meters, 42 mm at 500 meters, 41 mm at 1,000 meters, 35 mm at 1,500 meters, and 25 mm at 2,000 meters. The O-243 shell has a projectile mass of 2.2 kilograms, a muzzle velocity of 343 meters per second. Its armor penetration is 4 mm at 10 meters, 3 mm at 100 meters, and 2 mm at 500 meters, and at 1 mm at ranges of 1,000 meters and further. As with any light and reserve tanks, don't expect to do much damage at first. It is important to stick together with your team. That means you have more firepower when you come upon an enemy tank, and also means the enemy has more targets to shoot at, making you a less inviting target. The T-26 is a relatively slow and lightly armored tank. Make sure to keep in mind that reversing the tank is especially slow, and that you may not be able to easily duck behind cover while moving backwards. I hope that this information has proved helpful. If you liked the video, please do like the video. If you would like to see more videos like this, feel free to subscribe to the channel, and if you think anyone else would like this video, don't be afraid to share it. This is Dauntless Sam. Thanks for watching.